to Hezbollah in the north, Hamas in the south, Iran in the... But look at what's happened just this summer. You now have a triangular threat in the south. Sinai has become a threat because it's become a staging ground for terrorist acts, for weapons smuggling, for gathering of radical terrorist groups. And you've got Egypt, and we know that the peace treaty there is hanging by a thread. And I have to say, people here read about what happened with the assault on the Israeli embassy in Cairo. I watched a kind of documentary on it on Israeli TV. What really troubled me was what you were speaking about before. It was the hatred in those who were assaulting the embassy. It was the anti-Semitic cries of incitement and hate. That you don't get over here, you don't see it. But this is the kind of thing that is being internalized by Israelis. This is what they're seeing. This is what the Obamas of the world are not sensing. That's just on the southern front. And Hamas has gone from 5,000 rockets to over 10,000 rockets in 2 years. Now, in the northern front, when we were worried about Hezbollah, Hezbollah was a kind of militia outside the government of Lebanon. Hezbollah is now part of the government of Lebanon. Since the Israel-Hezbollah war of 2006, when Hezbollah had 10,000 missiles, they now have 55,000 missiles. And the missiles are capable of reaching not just northern Israel, but all parts of Israel. Then you add, because we always were worried about the Shiite radical crescent, led by Iran with Hezbollah and Iraq. Now you've got developing a Sunni radical crescent, which is being led by Turkey. So Turkey, which had been a strategic ally of Israel, is now almost leading the rejectionist forces, certainly in its rhetoric and its own incitement and the like. And I'm not even speaking about, all other issues of delegitimization and the like. So there is this, in my sense, is a critical mass of threat, and I just want to read something, those of you may want to take a look at it, because Bret Stephens wrote an article on this. You may have seen it in the Wall Street Journal yesterday called Israel's Predicament. But there was something in there that links up with what you were saying, and I found it startling and even dangerous. He says, and after he goes through all the various threats, some of which I've mentioned here and others, he says, one other item. On September 5th, it was reported that an associate director of the New Israel Fund was cited in a February 2001 State Department cable now released by WikiLeaks.
My client. I congratulated him the other day for...
But this is the associate director of the New Israel Fund saying, quote, the disappearance of a Jewish state would not be the tragedy that Israelis fear, since it would become more democratic. Now, this is an astonishing statement, as Bret Stephens says. Maybe the case, as he puts it, of the now former New Israel Fund official is a relatively rare one, or maybe it's just rare to have such off-the-record candor now find its way into the public
domain. Well, as you know,
domain.
one of the two founders of J Street, also in an early bit of his writing, said that the establishment of the State of Israel may in retrospect be seen as an unavoidable tragedy, and that it could have been avoided. So, you get both in J Street and the New Israel Fund, they're both trying very, very hard to broaden their base, and they rarely have red lines in the sand. Many of the people in those organizations are strongly supportive of Israel. I have to tell you, I think Ben-Ami himself is a supporter of Israel. But I think he has allowed into his organization people who support boycott, investment, sanctions. The same thing is true of the New Israel Fund. Look, any group, there are probably some people in AIPAC whose politics we probably wouldn't agree with on the extreme other side. But it's very important that that organizations that purport to speak on behalf of the Jewish community have some sense of who is becoming part of them. And I think this New Israel Fund, I also want to comment on your point as well. there's a lot of people who blame Israel for Turkey turning against it or for Egypt turning against it. I think it's an absolutely false accusation. I think Turkey has an agenda. I think that the Prime Minister of Turkey years ago has been looking for excuses. You know, he was given an excuse when some diplomat put him put a Turkish diplomat on a lower chair. Then there was another episode. Every excuse in the world, but the best proof that they would be doing exactly the same thing, even if there had been no flotilla, if there had been no response by Israel and Egypt, in which tragically some Egyptian policemen had been killed. Just look at Jordan. Nothing has happened in Jordan. Israel hasn't done a thing to provoke Jordan. And now there are all kinds of demonstrations and attacks on the Israeli embassy in Jordan as well. This is a changing Middle East. I predicted 3 or 4 years ago in writing that Israel could not count on its peace treaty with Egypt continuing, that Egypt was hanging on with a thread by Mubarak. At that time it looked like Mubarak would die, and that there would be a succession fight and the Muslim Brotherhood might very well take over. And then I also said I was worried very much about secular Turkey, that Ataturk's Turkey is dead, and that if you go just to Istanbul, you don't see the problem. You have to go to the interior of Turkey, and you see that the interior of Turkey is pre-Ataturk. These are the people who killed the Armenians. I mean, these are anti-Christian and anti-Jewish fanatics. Remember, it wasn't the Saudis who killed the Armenians. The first genocide, the first Islamic genocide against non-Muslims in modern times was conducted by the Turkish people. And they still deny it, but obviously it was true. And they were just looking for excuses, and they are looking for excuses. I think Israel has to prepare its military now for the next decades in which there will be no effective peace treaty with Egypt, no effective alliance with Turkey. I'm not suggesting either country will attack. Egypt is a paper tiger militarily and would be vanquished in 2 days, and the Sinai would be recovered. Egypt poses no real military threat to Israel today. Lebanon poses a greater military threat to Israel. Ironically, Lebanon, which was always a paper tiger, poses a greater threat militarily than Egypt does. But Turkey, my God, imagine what will happen if Turkey actually accompanies a flotilla with its navy and engages in a naval battle with Israel. I would hope that President Obama would immediately announce that it would be thrown out of NATO if they did that. But I haven't heard that yet. I've heard it from some members of Congress, but I haven't heard it from the administration. Turkey is trying to have it both ways. It has one eye to the west and one eye to the east. When it was not allowed into the European Union, it determined that it would become the leader of the Middle East, and it's determined to do that, and the way to do that is the scapegoat. Scapegoat, you know, when countries wanted to come to power, they would scapegoat Jews. Today, when countries want to come to regional power, they scapegoat the Jewish state. It's just a variation on the same thing, and it's very, very dangerous. And Israel now has to refigure its military. Israel has never had a military that was figured around the potential of the dangers that it now faces, because it never faced any real dangers, existential dangers at least, from rockets. That causes civilian deaths, but it's not a great military threat. But it faces existential dangers from Turkey and from Iran, which are interesting. 2 non-Arab Muslim countries pose the greatest threat to Israel's existence today.
How does one convey to a political leadership in the United States, to the publics in the United States, this critical mass of threat, this set of existential dangers, when the American psyche at this point is once again wrapped up in the economy and the likes, in domestic issues? And how do we get them to connect to this threat, which creates a disconnect, because Israelis and Jews feel it, although there is a generational divide even in that, but others are preoccupied, understandably, with their domestic concerns.
No, it's a very, very important question. And, you know, one of the great dangers of what J Street and New Israel Fund and others are doing today is by blaming Israel for everything, they're setting up a situation where if Israel were to get into trouble militarily, many people would say, well, it was Israel's fault. If they had just recognized the Palestinian state, if they had just ended the occupation a little earlier, then they wouldn't have been attacked by Egypt or by Lebanon or by Turkey or by Iran. It's total nonsense. The Palestinians have always been a pawn in this. The Turks aren't doing this because they love the Palestinians. The Turks are doing this because they love the Turks and they want to see increased Turkish power. But I think that so many young people today, so many people in the Obama generation and lower, think that the settlements are the sole barrier to peace in the Middle East, that they've come to believe this. It's become part of their worldview. And therefore, if there were to be an existential threat to Israel, many would now say it's Israel's fault. Whereas in 67 and 73, clearly nobody believed that. Everybody knew that Israel had done everything it could. But I think the perception around Europe, the perception in the academy, has now changed. It's very, very difficult to put foreign policy on the electoral issue. It's just as difficult in Canada as it is in the United States. People don't vote foreign policy. I do not believe that that election in my old neighborhood in Brooklyn, in which the Republicans won for the first time in 92 years, you know, Israel was an important factor, but it was not the only factor. Many, many people, non-Jewish and liberal Jews, voted for the Republican because of the economy. And we have to figure out a way of linking the two in some way as well. I mean, to show how, you know, Israel has been a leader in job creation, has been a leader in high technology, and the idea that the United States abandons its friends and follows the first politically correct winds in the Middle East is not good for America. Now, the problem, of course, is you have people both on the right and the left who are taking views that are antagonistic to Israel. For example, in the Republican Party, you have Ron Paul. It used to be Pat Buchanan. But Ron Paul and his son, who's the senator from Kentucky, are very anti-Israel today on the Republican Party. By the way, it's losing them a lot of votes because many people... The other thing that I worry about deeply, and it was the New York Times front page story yesterday, I never, ever want to see Israel become a wedge issue dividing Republicans from Democrats. Never. I never want to see it become a wedge issue in Canada, dividing the parties. Because if you have it a wedge issue, you can always lose. Whereas if both sides support Israel, it's a win-win. And it's always been that both sides support Israel. It's still true. Most Democratic congressmen, most Democratic senators are strongly supportive of Israel. We have to keep it that way. We can't ever allow Israel to become a wedge issue between conservatives and liberals. We may be losing that fight between Democrats and Republicans. That's why it's so important to have people like Irwin and myself. People tell me all the time, why don't you become a Republican? Why don't you join us on the right? I almost wrote a book saying why I left the left but couldn't join the right. I could never join the right. But it's very important to have Jews and supporters of Israel be active in the Democratic Party, be active in the party that Irwin's active in. It's very important that our views be on all sides of the political spectrum. And it's always wrong for people to say that Jews should vote Republican or Jews should vote Democrat. We shouldn't vote as a bloc for any issue relating to Israel. It should never become a wedge issue.
I can't tell you, Alan, how many people in the last election we had here came over to me and said, if you were only a conservative, they would make things easier.